Baxter had sworn he would never save another soul, especially not one with blue skin. But when two terrified alien children stood between him and certain death, begging their own father not to kill him, he realized he could not walk past them. The forest breathed around Baxter like a living creature possessed of malevolent intent. Every rustle speaking volumes about potential danger lurking in shadows. Every subtle movement of leaves suggesting threats that could materialize without warning. At 45 years old, his body had become a detailed map of violence endured and survived. Scars crisscrossing his weathered face and calloused hands like rivers carved into ancient stone by relentless erosion. He moved through the dense undergrowth without producing sound, his worn leather boots finding secure purchase on moss and decaying leaf matter with the practiced precision of a predator who had been born into these woods and shaped by their brutal lessons. The homemade axe gripped firmly in his scarred hands was heavy enough to require considerable strength just to carry, its blade maintained with obsessive care until it could split bone as easily as soft wood. The wooden handle worn smooth and dark by years of killing both animals and enemies. His breathing came slow and carefully measured, despite the substantial weight of the weapon in his pack. His pale gray eyes constantly scanning the green maze surrounding him, with the cold calculation of someone who understood that survival meant eternal vigilance. Every sense remained on highest alert for the slightest indication of danger. Every muscle in his battle-hardened body remained coiled and ready to spring into violent action at a moment's notice. This was what he had been transformed into after the savage wars that had ravaged this world, after witnessing the brutal deaths of everyone he had ever cared about, after everything that made him human had been systematically stripped away except the primal and overwhelming need to survive another day in this merciless wilderness. He was hunting for food to sustain himself through the coming weeks, and the forest knew it with the instinctive awareness that prey animals develop when a skilled predator enters their territory. A branch cracked somewhere off to his left, the sound sharp and distinct enough to cut through the ambient noise of wind and rustling leaves. Baxter froze instantly in mid-step, his entire body going absolutely still, as if he had been carved from the same wood as the surrounding trees, becoming part of the landscape itself. His scarred fingers tightened incrementally on the worn axe handle, knuckles whitening with the pressure as his muscles prepared for explosive action. The sound came again moments later, closer this time and more deliberate, a purposeful scraping against rough bark that suggested something was moving with intention rather than random wandering. He shifted his weight with agonizing slowness, redistributing his mass to avoid making any sound, positioning his body carefully behind the substantial trunk of a thick tree, his experienced eyes narrowing to slits as he tracked the source of the disturbance with the patience of someone who had survived countless similar situations by refusing to rush. His heart maintained its steady and slow rhythm, beating with the measured cadence of a man who had stared death directly in the face too many times over too many years to still fear its approach. The dense undergrowth parted gradually, and a scaled creature approximately the size of a large hunting dog emerged into the small clearing, its thick hide mottled in shades of green and brown that provided perfect camouflage against the forest floor. It paused to sniff the air with visible caution, its forked tongue flicking out repeatedly to taste for the presence of prey or predator. Baxter remained motionless and watched with absolute patience, his tactical mind calculating the precise distance between them, the optimal angle for attack, and the exact amount of force that would be required to kill it quickly and efficiently. When the creature finally turned its vulnerable back toward him, he moved with the decisive speed of a striking snake. 3 completely silent steps closed the distance, and the heavy axe came down in a brutal and perfectly controlled arc, the blade cleaving cleanly through spine and ribs with a wet crunching sound that echoed briefly in the small space. The creature collapsed immediately, its body twitching in the involuntary spasms of sudden death, and Baxter pulled the embedded blade free without any ceremony or hesitation, already scanning the surrounding area for additional threats that might have been attracted by the brief sounds of combat. He cleaned the blood-slicked blade methodically on a patch of soft moss, his movements practiced and automatic from countless repetitions, when he became aware of a new sound penetrating the forest ambiance. water cascading over stone, the distant but powerful roar of a substantial waterfall maintaining its constant rhythm somewhere ahead through the trees. His leather canteen was nearly empty after a long morning of tracking, and despite his deeply ingrained distrust of open spaces where he could be easily spotted, he desperately needed to refill his water supply before dehydration became a serious concern. Baxter adjusted the weight of his pack across his shoulders, checked methodically to ensure his hunting knife remained secure in its sheath at his belt, and began moving cautiously toward the sound of falling water. The forest gradually began to thin as he advanced, golden shafts of sunlight breaking through the dense canopy overhead in brilliant columns that seemed almost alien and otherworldly after the perpetual twilight that dominated beneath the interlocked branches. The thunderous roar of water grew steadily louder with each careful step, eventually drowning out the normal sounds of the woodland environment, and he approached the source with significantly heightened caution born from hard experience. Water sources always attracted animals of all kinds, and animals in this savage wilderness almost invariably meant danger, of one form or another. The waterfall revealed itself as truly magnificent when he finally emerged from the tree line, a 50-foot cascade of crystalline water that crashed violently into a deep pool with stunning clarity, thick mist rising like ethereal smoke from the point of impact and catching the sunlight in rainbow fragments. Baxter approached the pool's edge with weapons ready, kneeling carefully on the smooth stones to fill his canteen with the cold, fresh water when something completely unexpected caught his experienced eye and made him freeze. A flash of distinctly unnatural blue color stood out sharply among the dominant green and brown tones of the natural forest environment, a color that had no business being in this location. He froze completely, his hand moving instinctively toward the axe handle with the automatic response of someone whose survival had always depended on quick reactions. The patch of blue shifted position slightly, and he finally saw them with shocking clarity. Two small figures huddled together behind a fallen and rotting log near the water's edge, their skin the distinctive and unmistakable cerulean shade of the alien species who had brought so much death and destruction to this world during the brutal wars. Children, obviously, and twins by their nearly identical appearance, appearing no more than 5 years old at most, their disproportionately large eyes currently filled with tears that tracked down their blue cheeks in clean lines through accumulated dirt and grime. They wore simple tunics that had once been well made, but were now torn and caked with mud from days of wandering lost, and their small hands clutched desperately at each other, with the intensity of those who understood on some instinctive level that separation meant death. When they finally noticed his presence and saw him watching them, their already large eyes went impossibly wide with abject terror, the whites showing all around the colored irises. They scrambled backward reflexively, pressing themselves hard against the rough bark of the fallen log as if they could somehow merge with it and disappear from view. But one of them, the marginally taller girl, somehow forced herself to take a trembling step forward, despite her obvious fear. Her voice emerged in broken and heavily accented human speech, each word carefully and deliberately pronounced as if she had practiced this specific phrase many times in preparation for exactly this situation, knowing her life might depend on communicating with humans. "Please, we need help desperately. We are lost and so scared." Her small hand, shaking visibly, pointed first at her sister and then at herself in introduction. "My name is Ivana. This is my sister Adati. Please, I am begging you to help us find our family." Baxter stared at them with an expression carved from stone, his face revealing absolutely nothing of his internal thoughts or emotions. He saw not innocent children in desperate need of adult protection, but instead the distinctive blue faces of the alien soldiers who had systematically killed his friends in brutal combat, who had burned his village to ashes with families still trapped inside their homes, who had left him with nothing remaining in his life except the physical scars covering his body and the psychological nightmares that plagued his sleep. He remembered Marcus in vivid detail, gutted by a serrated alien spear, while screaming desperately for mercy that never came, his intestines spilling onto the blood-soaked ground. He remembered Elena with painful clarity, her severed head mounted prominently on a sharpened wooden pike as a brutal warning to other humans, her dead eyes staring accusingly at nothing. He remembered with crystalline precision the harsh laughter of the blue-skinned alien warriors as they systematically torched homes with entire families still trapped inside. The screams of burning children echoing in his memory. His jaw clenched involuntarily, powerful muscles jumping visibly beneath the thick scar tissue that covered so much of his face. The children standing before him looking small and vulnerable bore no resemblance whatsoever to those hardened warriors who had destroyed everything he loved. But they wore the exact same blue skin, and, in his damaged mind, that single characteristic was sufficient justification for his response. He spat deliberately on the ground between them, a thick glob of saliva in pure contempt, then turned his scarred back on their increasingly desperate and pleading eyes, and walked away without a single word or backward glance. Behind him, clearly audible even over the roar of the waterfall, he heard Ivana's young voice break completely into racking sobs of despair, heard Adati's high-pitched wail of terrified hopelessness, but he absolutely refused to look back or reconsider. Let them suffer in this wilderness, he thought with bitter satisfaction. Let them experience firsthand what it feels like to be abandoned without hope, to be left completely alone to die slowly and painfully in an environment that shows no mercy. The dense forest swallowed him completely within moments, and their desperate cries faded gradually into nothing more than the constant rush of the waterfall and the whisper of wind through leaves overhead. Baxter moved deeper into the familiar woods with determined purpose, but his mind unwillingly drifted back to another time, another place, before the wars had turned him into this hollow shell, walking in human skin. He remembered teaching a young boy named Alwyn how to track deer through these very forests, remembered the unbridled pride that had shone in the child's eyes when he made his first successful kill, the way his small hands had trembled with excitement as he held up the arrow that had found its mark. He remembered comforting a crying girl named Alice, who had scraped her knee badly after falling from a tree she had been warned not to climb, bandaging the wound with gentle hands that now only knew how to kill and destroy, whispering soothing words that had dried her tears and brought back her smile. Those memories felt like they belonged to a completely different person, someone who had died long ago in the fires and left only this scarred imitation shambling through the world in his place. But they were still there, those ghosts of his former self, still whispering to him with voices he had tried so hard to silence that what he had just done was wrong, fundamentally and irredeemably wrong. He had once been the person children ran to for protection, not away from in terror. He had once believed that protecting the innocent was the highest calling, regardless of who they were or where they came from. When had that changed? When had he become the monster that haunted his own nightmares? Baxter moved deeper into the familiar woods with determined purpose, his jaw set in a hard line, his pale eyes fixed unwaveringly ahead on the path before him. But something gnawed persistently at him from within, something he could not quite dismiss or rationalize away no matter how he tried. The vivid image of those two small faces, streaked with tears and dirt, kept surfacing repeatedly in his mind like drowned corpses floating inexorably to the surface of a still lake, refusing to sink back into the darkness where he wanted them. He shook his head violently from side to side, trying desperately to physically dislodge the unwanted memory from his consciousness. They were the enemy, he reminded himself forcefully. They represented everything that had destroyed his life. They deserved whatever terrible fate awaited them in this brutal and unforgiving wilderness. A threatening snarl erupted suddenly from dense brush to his left, low and distinctly guttural in tone. Baxter spun instantly with trained reflexes, his heavy axe coming up into defensive position as two dangerous creatures burst from the concealing undergrowth in coordinated attack. Runner wolves, the human settlers called them, though they bore absolutely no resemblance to the wolves from distant Earth. They moved with terrifying speed on four powerfully muscled legs, their bodies sleek and aerodynamic, covered completely in dark fur marked with distinctive stripes of electric blue that seemed to glow faintly. Their heads were unnaturally elongated, jaws filled with multiple rows of serrated teeth specifically designed by evolution to tear flesh from bone with maximum efficiency. They hunted cooperatively in packs of up to a dozen individuals, move fast as lightning when pursuing prey, and possess the documented ability to bring down creatures 3 times their own considerable size. These two specimens had unmistakable hunger burning in their yellow eyes, and they had deliberately chosen him as their next meal. The first wolf lunged without warning, transforming into a blur of muscle and gleaming fangs. Baxter sidestepped with practiced efficiency, bringing his heavy axe around in a powerful horizontal slash that caught the creature mid-leap with devastating impact. The sharpened blade bit deeply into its muscular shoulder, spinning the wolf completely around from the tremendous force of the blow. It yelped sharply, a sound eerily similar to tearing metal sheets, but recovered almost instantly despite the severity of its wound, hot blood streaming from the gaping tear in its flesh. The second wolf circled cautiously, searching patiently for an exploitable opening, its predatory eyes locked unwaveringly on his exposed throat as the primary target. Baxter kept moving in a controlled circle, never allowing both dangerous creatures to successfully flank him simultaneously, his worn boots finding secure purchase on the uneven ground with the ease of long practice and experience. The wounded wolf attacked again with renewed aggression, aiming lower this time in an attempt to hamstring him and bring him down. He brought the heavy axe down vertically with tremendous force, and the razor-sharp blade cleaved cleanly through its skull with a sound distinctly similar to splitting seasoned firewood. Bone fragments shattered explosively, brain matter sprayed in a wide arc, and the creature dropped instantly like a stone, dead before its body finished hitting the ground. The remaining wolf hesitated briefly, reassessing the threat level of this particular prey, its animal intelligence recognizing that this human was far more dangerous than anticipated. Baxter refused to give it sufficient time to think or develop a new strategy. He charged forward aggressively, roaring with primal fury, producing the intimidating sound of a man who had faced down death too many times over too many years to care anymore about his own mortality. The wolf met his aggressive charge despite its survival instincts, screaming warnings, and they collided violently in a desperate tangle of human limbs and animal fur and cold steel. Sharp teeth scraped harshly against his leather armguard, leaving deep grooves in the material, while curved claws raked viciously across his chest, tearing completely through his shirt, but fortunately missing the vulnerable skin beneath by mere millimeters. He drove his knee brutally into its rib cage with significant force, felt multiple bones crack audibly under the impact, then brought the heavy axe handle across its spine in a crippling blow. The wolf collapsed with a pained whimper, its back legs suddenly useless, and he ended its suffering quickly with a single efficient chop to the exposed neck. Silence fell heavily over the small clearing, broken only by his own labored breathing and the ever-present distant sound of the waterfall still audible. Through the trees, Baxter stood among the fresh corpses, thick blood dripping steadily from his axe blade onto the forest floor, and happened to catch his reflection in the polished steel. What he saw in that wavering mirror made him pause with sudden discomfort. Not a man looking back at him, but something else entirely. A thing without humanity. A killer shaped like a human, but with nothing recognizably human remaining inside the shell. The numerous scars covering his face seemed even deeper and more pronounced in the distorted reflection, his eyes appearing hollow and cold, completely devoid of warmth or compassion. He had looked directly into the terrified faces of defenseless children and walked away without experiencing even a shred of mercy or second thought, and that terrible realization hit him harder than any physical blow he had ever taken in decades of combat and violence. His hands began to shake uncontrollably, a visible tremor he could not suppress or control through willpower alone, and the familiar axe suddenly felt impossibly heavy in his weakening grip, as if it had absorbed all the weight of his sins and reflected them back. What had he become in his quest for survival? What kind of monster abandoned children to certain death simply because of the color of their skin? The questions burned in his mind like acid, and for the first time in years, Baxter felt something other than numbness. He felt shame, deep and corrosive, eating away at the armor of indifference he had so carefully constructed around his damaged heart. He turned back toward the waterfall without making any conscious decision, his feet carrying him along a path his rational mind had not yet accepted or approved. The sound of rushing water grew progressively louder with each step, and layered over it came another sound that made his blood run cold. A roar, deep and primal and terrifying, the distinctive sound of an apex predator that feared absolutely nothing in this world or any other. Baxter abandoned all pretense of caution and began to run with desperate urgency. He burst violently through the tree line, branches whipping at his face, and saw a nightmare made flesh standing before him. The Bone Crusher was the undisputed apex predator of this entire region, a thing of pure muscle and natural armor that stood an intimidating 8 feet tall at its massive shoulders. Its body was covered in thick blue fur, heavily matted and scarred from countless territorial battles over many years. But what made this creature truly terrifying beyond measure was the bone. Natural armor plates grew directly from its thick hide like a grotesque living exoskeleton, covering its head, shoulders, and muscular back in ridged white protection that could turn aside most weapons. Its massive jaws possessed the documented strength to snap a mature tree trunk cleanly in half. Its curved claws could disembowel a full-grown human with a single casual swipe, and it possessed the temperament of a rabid dog combined with the cunning of a seasoned predator. The massive beast stood directly before the fallen log, where the twin children cowered in absolute terror, its enormous head lowered aggressively, flaring nostrils scenting prey with eager anticipation. Ivana had somehow found the courage to position herself directly in front of her sister. Her small arms spread wide in a futile protective gesture, her entire body shaking violently with fear, but her young voice remaining surprisingly strong as she screamed at the approaching beast in her native alien language. It was the heartbreaking and futile courage of a child who did not yet understand through experience that bravery alone could not stop teeth and claws and overwhelming physical force. The Bone Crusher tensed its powerful muscles visibly, preparing to spring forward and end them, and time seemed to slow to a crawl for Baxter as he watched. Baxter did not think or plan or consider consequences. He simply acted on pure instinct and something deeper he could not name. His boots pounded heavily against the earth as he sprinted forward with every ounce of speed his body could generate. Heavy axe held high above his head, and he released a war cry that had not passed his lips in many long years. The sound was pure rage mixed with desperation, the howl of a man who had already lost everything he ever valued in life and would not permit one more unnecessary death to stain his conscience. The Bone Crusher's massive head snapped around with surprising speed, its small but intelligent eyes fixing on this new and unexpected threat, and it pivoted with remarkable agility for something so enormous and heavy. They met with the tremendous force of a landslide, the impact sending shockwaves through Baxter's entire body. He swung the heavy axe in the widest possible arc, aiming with desperate hope for the creature's armored head. But the blade skittered off harmlessly with a screech of metal, scraping across hardened calcium deposits. The violent impact sent painful shockwaves traveling up both his arms, nearly jarring the weapon completely from his grip despite his best efforts. The Bone Crusher retaliated by swiping with one massive paw, all its claws fully extended to maximum length, and Baxter threw himself sideways in a desperate evasion attempt. He was not quite fast enough to avoid contact completely. 3 razor-sharp talons caught him across his exposed ribs, tearing easily through shirt and flesh like they were tissue paper, and he felt the immediate hot rush of blood soaking through his clothing and running down his side. The pain was immediate and absolutely blinding in its intensity, but he had felt worse injuries during the wars and survived. He had experienced far worse and lived to fight another day. He rolled desperately away from the follow-up attack, came up swinging his axe wildly, and managed to catch the massive beast across its unarmored foreleg with a solid blow. The sharp blade bit deeply into muscle and tendon, and dark blood sprayed in a wide arc across the torn ground. The Bone Crusher roared with rage and pain, a sound so powerful it literally shook leaves from nearby trees, and lunged forward with murderous intent. Baxter dove desperately under its enormous bulk, feeling the ground shake violently as it landed with crushing force exactly where he had been standing just moments before. He came up behind the creature, gathered his remaining strength, and drove the axe deeply into the back of its rear leg, severing critical tendons with surgical precision. The Bone Crusher stumbled badly, favoring the severely wounded limb, and turned with terrifying speed despite its accumulating injuries. Its massive jaws snapped closed mere inches from Baxter's face, close enough that he could smell its rancid breath and see in horrifying detail the remnants of previous kills still lodged between its stained teeth. He stumbled backward desperately, his wounded side screaming in absolute agony with every movement, hot blood running freely down his leg and pooling uncomfortably in his boot. The bone crusher advanced steadily despite its limp, completely undeterred by its injuries, and Baxter knew with absolute certainty that he had only seconds remaining before it overwhelmed him through sheer size and power. He feinted dramatically to the left, and when the creature lunged predictably in that direction, he went hard right, bringing his heavy axe down with absolutely every ounce of strength he still possessed in his failing body. The blade found the narrow gap between bone plates at the vulnerable base of the skull, driving deep into brain and spinal cord simultaneously. The bone crusher convulsed violently, its massive body thrashing with tremendous force, nearly taking Baxter down with it in its death throes. He wrenched the embedded axe free with desperate effort, stumbled backwards several steps, and watched through blurring vision as the apex predator finally collapsed, twitched once more, and lay completely still in death. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening after the chaos of combat. Baxter swayed dangerously, his vision blurring severely at the edges, and dropped heavily to his knees on the blood-soaked ground. His side was on fire, blood flowing freely and continuously from the deep parallel gashes. He pressed one shaking hand firmly to the wound, trying desperately to stem the alarming flow, and looked up to see two small blue faces staring at him with a complex mixture of horror and hope written clearly across their features. Ivana took a tentative step forward, then another more confident one, her sister Adadi clutching her hands so tightly their knuckles showed white. They stopped just beyond arm's reach, as if genuinely afraid he might turn on them next despite having just saved their lives. Baxter coughed violently, tasted the distinctive copper flavor of blood in his mouth, and forced words through, teeth gritted against pain. "I will take you with me, only until your people are found and you are safely returned." Each word cost him tremendous effort, and he could feel creeping darkness encroaching steadily at the edges of his fading vision. He tore a long strip from his already ruined shirt, wrapped it tightly around his bleeding torso, and pulled it as tight as he could physically manage. The pain was absolutely excruciating and nearly made him black out, but the bleeding slowed to a more manageable rate. He forced himself to stand through pure willpower, swaying like a tree caught in a storm, and pointed firmly at them with his blood-stained hand. "You will follow me closely. Do not fall behind for any reason. If you do fall behind, I will not come back for you." The lie tasted bitter on his tongue, but he desperately needed them to understand the extreme severity of their situation. He turned and began walking unsteadily, each step requiring conscious effort and determination, and heard the soft padding of small feet following closely behind him. They were following his lead without question. Against all reason and historical precedent, he was leading enemy children through a wilderness that actively wanted them dead, and he honestly did not know why he was doing it. Hours passed in a haze of persistent pain and stubborn determination to keep moving forward. Baxter moved primarily on deeply ingrained instinct, choosing paths that offered maximum cover, carefully avoiding open areas where predators might easily spot them from a distance. His side throbbed painfully with every heartbeat, and he could feel the warmth of fresh blood continuously seeping through his makeshift bandage, despite his best efforts. Behind him, Ivana and Adadi struggled visibly to keep pace, their small legs working overtime to match his much longer stride. He did not slow down to accommodate them, could not afford to slow down. Every minute they spent exposed and vulnerable in the open was a minute closer to encountering death in one of its many forms. As they continued through increasingly difficult terrain, Baxter noticed Ivana beginning to lag even further behind, her steps becoming dangerously unsteady. He stopped abruptly and turned to see her face had taken on an unhealthy pallor beneath her blue skin, her breathing coming in short, desperate gasps that spoke of complete exhaustion. Aditi was doing her best to support her sister, trying desperately to keep her upright with arms that shook from the effort. But both children were clearly reaching the absolute limits of their endurance. Baxter cursed under his breath, recognizing the signs of severe exhaustion and dehydration, despite their recent drink from the stream. He scanned the surrounding area with tactical efficiency and spotted a massive fallen tree trunk that had been hollowed out over years by decay and insects, creating a natural shelter large enough for all of them. "Here now," he commanded, his voice brooking no argument as he pointed at the hollow interior. "Inside immediately." The twins crawled into the shelter with visible relief, and Baxter positioned himself at the entrance, his heavy axe laid across his knees within easy reach. He watched Ivana closely with growing concern, saw how she continued to shiver despite the relative warmth of the day, her small body trembling uncontrollably. He moved closer with difficulty, his own wounds screaming in protest, and knelt beside them to examine her more carefully. Her lips had taken on a distinctly bluish tinge, even for her species, and when he reached out to touch her forehead with hesitant fingers, her skin felt clammy and unnaturally cold to the touch. Shock, he realized with alarm. The accumulated terror and physical exertion had pushed her small body far past its breaking point, and if he did not act quickly, she would slip into something far worse. For a long moment that stretched into eternity, Baxter stared at the semi-conscious child before him, feeling something completely unfamiliar, stirring deep in his chest where he thought all emotion had been burned away. This was not part of any plan he had made. He was supposed to keep them alive by getting them moving forward, yes, but this required something more than just harsh commands and forced marches. This required genuine care, patient attention, the kind of nurturing gentleness he thought he had forgotten completely how to give after years of survival taking precedence over everything else. He looked at Adati, who was crying silently with tears streaming down her dirty face, her small hands clutching her sister's limp one with desperate intensity, and saw reflected in her terrified expression the same overwhelming fear he had felt when Elena had been killed before his eyes, when Marcus had died screaming his name. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice softer than it had been before, but still maintaining its commanding edge. "Your sister needs warmth and complete rest right now. We cannot move until she recovers enough strength. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Adadi nodded frantically, her large eyes fixed on his scarred face, and Baxter set to work with the focused intensity of someone who had seen death enough times to recognize its approach. He removed his pack with fumbling fingers, pulled out a small emergency blanket he had saved from his military days and kept folded at the bottom for years, and wrapped it carefully around Ivana's small, shivering form. Then he did something he had not done in more years than he could count. He gathered the child gently in his arms with awkward care, holding her against his chest where his body heat could transfer to her, and he began to speak. Not harshly, not with sharp commands that demanded obedience, but with the kind of steady, deeply reassuring tone he had once used naturally with frightened children in what felt like another lifetime. "You are safe now. I have you secure. Your sister is here beside you. You are not alone anymore." Adadi watched with wide, disbelieving eyes as this scarred, terrifying man, who had been barking orders at them for hours, transformed before her into something fundamentally different, something almost gentle. After several long minutes of Baxter holding Ivana and speaking softly, her sister's breathing finally began to steady and deepen, and healthy color slowly started to return to her face. Her eyes fluttered open after what felt like an eternity, confused and disoriented, clearly unsure where she was, and she looked up at Baxter's heavily scarred face hovering so close to hers. For a suspended moment, neither moved or spoke. Then, with a small sob that came from somewhere deep inside, she pressed her face firmly against his chest and began to cry, not from fear or pain, but from overwhelming relief at being held and comforted. Baxter held her with stiff, awkward arms that had not embraced anyone in years, but he did not pull away or push her aside. He let her cry freely, let her release all the accumulated terror and exhaustion, and something inside him that had been frozen solid for countless years began, very slowly and painfully, to thaw. When Ivana finally calmed enough to stop crying, he set her down with surprising gentleness and checked her over one more time with methodical care. Satisfied that she would recover with adequate rest and continued warmth, He turned his attention to teaching them both something absolutely crucial for their survival. If he collapsed completely from his infected wounds, if something fatal happened to him out here, these children desperately needed to know how to survive on their own in this hostile environment. "Come here, both of you," he commanded, his voice returning to its characteristically harsh tone, but with an unmistakable undertone of something else. Something that might have been genuine concern. "I am going to teach you something vitally important for staying alive. Watch very carefully and remember everything I show you." He used his knife to cut bark carefully from a nearby tree, showing them with patient demonstration how to identify the healing properties by the distinctive smell and unique texture. He demonstrated how to apply it properly to a wound, how to bind it securely without cutting off circulation. Ivana watched with intense focus despite her exhaustion, her small hands carefully mimicking his movements as he worked. Then he led them to a rotting log and showed them how to find protein-rich edible grubs beneath the soft bark, how to distinguish the safe varieties from the poisonous ones by their specific markings and behavior. "If something happens to me out here," he said with brutal honesty, not bothering to soften the harsh reality of their situation, "you will need to know these things to survive. The healing bark stops infection from spreading. The grubs will keep you fed when there is nothing else. Do you both understand this clearly?" Both girls nodded with solemn faces, and for the next hour Baxter taught them essential survival skills, with the patience of a man who understood intimately that knowledge represented the razor-thin difference between life and death in the wilderness. Ivana proved to be a remarkably quick learner despite her young age, absorbing information with the desperate intensity of someone who knew instinctively that her life depended on remembering every detail. Adati was slower to grasp the concepts but proved more methodical in her approach, carefully repeating each lesson multiple times until she had it completely memorized. When Baxter finally judged them as ready as they could possibly be given such a short time, or at least as ready as two 5-year-old children could be, he allowed himself a brief rest against the fallen log. He leaned heavily against the rough bark with exhaustion, his wound throbbing mercilessly with each shallow breath, and closed his eyes for just a moment of respite. When he opened them again, he found both girls had moved significantly closer to where he sat. Ivana had collected more of the healing bark without being asked or commanded, and was holding it out to him with both small hands extended. Adati had found clean moss and a small improvised container of water she had painstakingly filled from a nearby puddle. They were trying to care for him, using the very skills he had just taught them, and the simple gesture hit him with completely unexpected force. "We help you now," Ivana said in her halting, heavily accented human speech. "Like you help us." Baxter took the offered bark with hands that trembled slightly, allowed them to clean his infected wound with surprising gentleness, and apply the fresh medicine with careful attention, and felt something he had not experienced in more years than he cared to count. Not gratitude exactly, not yet anything approaching affection, but a kind of profound recognition. These children were not just burdens to be carried and protected until their people found them. They were individuals with their own strength, brave and remarkably resourceful, fighting desperately for survival, just as he had fought his entire life. They were, in their own way, despite their youth and small size, warriors worthy of respect. When Adati stumbled badly over an exposed root, nearly falling flat on her face, Baxter stopped abruptly. He turned, looked at her with eyes that held no visible warmth or compassion, and barked a single harsh word that left no room for argument. "Get up immediately!" She scrambled to her feet with desperate haste, tears streaming down her dirt-streaked face, but making absolutely no sound of complaint or protest. Fear of him had completely overridden her physical exhaustion, and some distant part of Baxter's mind felt sick at the thought. He was deliberately terrorizing innocent children, but terror kept them alive and moving, and keeping them alive was the only thing that mattered now, so he would be their source of terror and discipline. They reached a small stream cutting through the forest, and he commanded them to drink while they had the opportunity. While they cupped cold water in their small hands, he refilled his canteen and examined his wound with clinical detachment. The bleeding had not stopped completely despite the bandage, and the ragged edges of the gashes were already showing unmistakable signs of infection setting in. He desperately needed rest and proper treatment, but neither was a viable option in their current situation. He splashed cold water on his face, washing away accumulated blood and sweat, and caught his reflection in the slowly moving stream. The man looking back at him was a ghost, hollow-eyed and grim, a walking specter trapped in damaged flesh. "Move now," he growled without any trace of patience, and they moved without hesitation or complaint. By the time the sun began its slow descent toward the horizon, painting the alien sky in dramatic shades of orange and crimson, Baxter's remaining strength was failing rapidly. His legs felt like they had been replaced with lead weights. His vision swam alarmingly with every step forward, and the wound in his side had transitioned from burning pain to a dull, throbbing ache that spoke ominously of deeper internal damage. He found a defensible position for the night, a small natural hollow nestled between two massive boulders, and directed the exhausted children inside with curt gestures. He gathered fallen branches and dry leaves, anything that would burn, and used his precious flint to spark a small fire in a shallow pit. He dug with his hands. The flames would be hidden effectively by the surrounding rocks, invisible from more than a few yards away, but the heat would keep them alive through the freezing night. The temperature dropped with alarming rapidity as darkness fell completely, the alien sky above filling with unfamiliar constellations that held no meaning or comfort. Baxter sat with his back against the rough boulder, heavy axe laid across his knees within easy reach, watching the dark tree line intently for any signs of movement or threat. Behind him, he heard the twins whispering to each other in their liquid native language, words he could not understand but whose fearful tone spoke volumes about their emotional state. They huddled together for warmth, their thin torn tunics offering little protection against the biting wind that swept relentlessly through the hollow. He watched them from the corner of his eye, saw them shiver violently, saw their blue skin take on an unhealthy, darker hue as the cold penetrated their small bodies. He told himself firmly to ignore their discomfort, told himself repeatedly they were the enemy, that their suffering meant absolutely nothing to him. But the image of them pressing desperately together for warmth, looking so small and fragile and vulnerable, worked its way steadily, under his carefully constructed defenses like water seeping through cracks. With a curse that would have made even hardened soldiers blush, he shrugged off his fur-lined cloak, the one remaining piece of warmth he had salvaged from his old life before everything burned, and tossed it at them without ceremony. "Use it for warmth," he snapped harshly, deliberately not looking at them. "I will not have you dying of cold after all this effort to keep you alive." Small hands picked up the cloak hesitantly, and after a long moment of confused hesitation, they wrapped themselves carefully in its warmth. Baxter sat in his thin, torn shirt, feeling the cold bite deeply into his exposed skin, and told himself repeatedly it meant nothing. It was purely practical. Dead children could not be returned to their people. That was all this was. But when he heard Ivana's small voice whisper, "Thank you," in broken but earnest human speech, something deep in his chest constricted painfully. He fed the small fire throughout the long night, keeping it small but steady for warmth, and did not sleep even for a moment. Every sound in the darkness could potentially be a threat, and his body was too severely damaged to fight at anything less than full alertness. The wound in his side oozed continuously despite his best efforts, and fever began to set in gradually as infection took firm hold. By morning, he was shaking with chills despite sitting near the fire, and when he tried to stand, his legs nearly gave out beneath him. During the darkest hours before dawn, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the cold was at its most bitter, Baxter heard soft crying coming from beneath his cloak. Aditi was sobbing quietly, trying desperately to muffle the sound but failing. Ivana was whispering to her in their language, words of comfort that seemed inadequate against whatever fear gripped the younger twin. Baxter found himself speaking before he consciously decided to, his voice rough but not unkind. "What frightens her?" There was a long silence. Then Ivana's voice emerged from the darkness, small and uncertain. "She has bad dreams. Dreams of the big beast. Dreams of being alone and lost forever in the dark forest where no one will find us. She is only 5 years old." She does not understand why this happened to us, why we got lost, why our parents were not there when the beast came. She thinks maybe they do not want us anymore because we were bad and wandered away. Baxter felt something twist in his chest at those words. He remembered being 5 years old himself, remembered the overwhelming fear of being lost, the terror that perhaps his parents had abandoned him deliberately. He remembered, too, how his father had found him after hours of searching and had held him without speaking, just held him until the fear subsided and the world made sense again. He was not this child's father. He was barely even human anymore by most measures. But he could offer something, some small comfort in the darkness. "Listen to me, both of you," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air. "Your parents did not abandon you. They are searching for you right now. They have not stopped searching since you disappeared. When they find you, and they will find you, they will hold you and never want to let you go. You wandered away by accident, as children do. That does not make you bad. That makes you children. Do you understand?" "How do you know they search for us?" Ivana asked, doubt coloring her words. "How can you be certain they want us back?" "Because I see what they left behind at the waterfall," Baxter said, and realized as he spoke that it was true. "I saw the small toys dropped in haste. I saw the blanket that smells of home. They brought these things to comfort you when they found you. People who do not care do not bring comfort items. People who do not love do not search desperately through dangerous wilderness. Your parents love you. Never doubt this." There was a long silence. Then Adadi's crying slowly subsided. A moment later, he felt small feet padding across the cold ground toward him, and then both girls were sitting beside him, not touching but close enough that he could feel their presence. They stayed like that for the rest of the night, the scarred human warrior and two blue-skinned children who had been enemies by accident of birth, sharing warmth and the fragile comfort of not being alone in the darkness. When the first light of dawn began to creep across the sky, Ivana spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "What is your name?" "You know our names, but we do not know yours." "Baxter," he said simply. "Baxter," she repeated carefully, testing the unfamiliar sounds. "When we tell our parents how you saved us, we will say Baxter the Protector, so they know you are good. Will you remember us when we are gone?" The question caught him off guard. Would he remember them? Two children who had inadvertently shown him that he was not completely dead inside, that there was still something human remaining beneath the layers of scar tissue and trauma. How could he ever forget? "Yes," he said quietly, "I will remember you both. Always." Ivana was watching him closely, her large eyes filled with concern that looked far too adult on such a young face. She said something urgently to Adadi, and together they approached him cautiously, as if he were a dangerous animal that might snap at any moment. Ivana held out a small piece of dried meat from their pockets, something they had saved from before they were lost, and offered it to him with both hands. Baxter stared at it, then at her small, earnest face, and felt something crack deep inside him. These children who had every possible reason to hate humans, who had been abandoned by him once already, were trying to care for him. He took the meat, chewed it slowly, and managed a single nod of acknowledgement. It was not thanks, not exactly, but it was recognition, as they understood. Miles away at the waterfall where the dead bone crusher lay cooling, another scene was unfolding with its own dramatic tension. The twins' parents had arrived with a group of experienced trackers, their faces etched deeply with desperation and fear. They had been searching continuously for 2 full days since their daughters wandered off during a family gathering, and every passing hour increased the likelihood they would find only bodies. The mother, Kirana, fell to her knees at the sight of the dead predator, her hands covering her mouth as she processed the carnage. The bone crusher was known and feared by all, avoided by anyone who understood the dangers of this world. Nothing survived an encounter with one of these beasts. The father, Torin, examined the ground with the practiced eye of an experienced tracker. He saw the distinctive footprints of the bone crusher, saw where it had approached the log, saw where something had intercepted it. Human boot prints, deep and heavy, indicating a man of significant size and weight. He saw the signs of violent combat, the deep gouges in the earth, the massive bloodstain, where the human had been wounded. And then he saw something that made his blood run cold. Scraps of his daughter's tunics, torn and scattered, pools of red human blood mixed with the darker ichor of the beast, and small footprints leading away from the scene. Not alone, but alongside the human's tracks. Torrens' mind filled in the gaps with absolute horror that threatened to consume him, his imagination conjuring nightmares so vivid they felt like memories. A human hunter had come upon this scene after the bone crusher was dead or dying, had found his daughters cowering and terrified behind the log, and instead of showing mercy to lost children, instead of helping them find their way home safely, he had taken them. Taken them alive for purposes that made Torrens' skin crawl with such intense rage and disgust that he could taste bile rising in his throat. He remembered the stories from the brutal war with painful clarity, the documented atrocities committed by both sides in the name of vengeance, tales of prisoners taken and never seen again, of cruelty inflicted for sport or revenge or simple hatred of the other species. His imagination, fueled by a father's worst fears, conjured the most terrible scenarios possible, each more horrifying than the last. His daughters, so small and innocent and completely helpless, in the hands of a human warrior who had already demonstrated beyond any doubt the capacity for extreme and brutal violence. The blood spattered on the stones could have been from forcing them to move when they were too exhausted to continue, from punishing them for crying out in fear or daring to resist his commands, from unspeakable things he could not bear to contemplate without his sanity threatening to shatter. Kirana joined him with trembling hands, her face pale as death itself as she examined the evidence. Spread before them, she was a skilled healer by training and long practice, experienced in reading the stories that wounds and blood patterns told to those who knew how to look, and what she saw confirmed her absolute worst fears. The human had been badly injured. That much was abundantly clear from the quantity and distribution of blood loss visible on the rocks. But the trail showed he had continued moving despite wounds that should have incapacitated any normal person. That spoke of iron determination, of someone driven by dark purpose rather than mere survival instinct. But what purpose could possibly drive a human to take two alien children deep into this wilderness? The scraps of fabric torn from their tunics, the way the small footprints seemed to stumble and drag in several places along the trail, all painted a picture of children being driven forward against their will by someone who cared nothing for their welfare or suffering. She found a small piece of blue fabric caught on a thorn bush, recognized it immediately as part of Adati's tunic, and clutched it to her chest as tears streamed down her face. "He is taking them somewhere specific with purpose," she whispered, her voice breaking with the tremendous effort of speaking through her terror and grief. "We have to find them before he reaches wherever he is going, before he does whatever terrible thing he plans to do with them." He stood with visible effort, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles cracked audibly, and addressed his warriors in a voice that shook with barely controlled fury. "We hunt this human. We find him quickly. And when we do, I will make him beg for the mercy he did not show my children." The warriors, 7 in total, armed with spears and bows, nodded grimly. They knew Torrens' reputation, knew he was not a man given to empty threats. If they found this human, his death would be slow and inventive. They set off at a punishing pace, following the trail with grim determination. The tracker, a lean warrior named Vesh, pointed out the signs. The human was wounded. That much was clear from the blood trail. But he was also experienced, choosing difficult terrain that would slow pursuit, covering his tracks when possible, moving with the efficiency of a military scout. And the small footprints of the children appeared regularly, showing they were alive and walking, though Vesh could not determine if they were being forced or led. To Torrens' rage-clouded mind, there was no question. His daughters were captives, and every hour they remained in that monster's hands was an eternity of potential suffering. The pursuit party moved through the forest like vengeful spirits, driven by fury and fear in equal measure. They found the clearing where Baxter had killed the runner wolves, saw the brutal carnage he had left behind, and it only confirmed their darkest assumptions. This was clearly a man who killed without hesitation or mercy, who moved through the wilderness leaving death in his wake like a plague. What chance did two small, defenseless children have against such a monster? Hours later, they reached the river crossing, and what they found there made Torin's heart stop completely. The riverbank showed clear signs of struggle in the churned mud and disturbed stones. There was blood on the rocks, fresh enough to still be slightly wet, human blood from the look and smell of it. The small footprints showed where the children had approached the water's edge, and then there were signs of violent disturbance, as if something had been dragged or pulled into the rushing current. Kirana fell to her knees at the water's edge, her hands reaching out to touch the blood-stained stones with trembling fingers. "He hurt them here," she sobbed, her voice thick with anguish. "He forced them into the water. They must have been so terrified, so cold. Why would he do this? What kind of monster tortures children like this?" Torin stood rigid, staring at the evidence, his mind constructing a horrifying narrative from what he saw. The human had made the children cross this dangerous river despite their exhaustion and fear. One of them must have fallen or refused to continue, and he had dragged her through the water as punishment, leaving his own blood on the rocks from his wounds. The thought of his daughters being subjected to such cruelty, of them crying out in terror as they were forced through the freezing current, filled him with a rage so intense it was almost blinding. He made a silent vow that when he found this human, death would come slowly and painfully, stretched out over days if necessary to match every moment of suffering his children had endured. "We are close now," Vesh reported, his voice tight with anger as he examined the tracks. "The blood is fresh. He is weakening from his wounds. His pace has slowed considerably. We will catch him within hours, perhaps less." The warriors checked their weapons with renewed determination, and they pressed forward with even greater urgency. Behind them, Karana carefully picked up a small sandal she found wedged between rocks, one that belonged to Adadi. She clutched it to her chest and whispered prayers to ancient gods she had not believed in for years, begging them to keep her daughters alive just a little longer, just until they could reach them and end this nightmare. Baxter knew they were being followed. The forest spoke to those who understood its language, and he heard the subtle changes that indicated pursuit. Birds that should have been calling were silent. Small animals that typically foraged during these hours were nowhere to be seen. And there, in the soft earth by the stream where they had refilled their water, fresh tracks that were not his, 5 hours old, maybe 6. A group, at least 6 individuals, moving fast and light. Professionals. He looked at Ivana and Adadi, who sat resting against a tree, exhausted from the morning's march. Their small faces were drawn, with fatigue, but they did not complain. He had taught them not to, taught them through harsh words and harsher lessons that survival had no room for weakness, and they had learned, these blue-skinned children who should have been his enemies. They had learned to move quietly, to watch their footing, to drink when he commanded and rest only when he allowed. They had learned discipline under the tutelage of a broken man who knew nothing else to teach. The wound in his side had worsened. Despite his efforts to clean and rebind it, infection had set in with a vengeance. His skin was hot to the touch, sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool air, and his hands had developed a tremor that he could not fully control. He knew the signs. He was dying, slowly but certainly, and if he did not receive proper treatment within the next day or two, the infection would spread to his blood, and that would be the end. But he could not stop, could not rest, because those tracks belonged to people looking for these children, and if they found them together, they would assume the worst. He called Ivana over with a gesture. She came immediately, and he was struck again by how quickly she had adapted to his commands. Children were resilient in ways adults had forgotten. He knelt down, bringing his scarred face level with hers, and spoke in a low voice. "Your people are coming. Do you understand?" She nodded, her eyes brightening with hope and relief. "But they will not understand that I am helping you. They will see me and think I have hurt you. Do you understand this?" Ivana's face clouded with confusion, then dawning comprehension. She looked at Adadi, then back at Baxter, and her small hand reached out to touch the blood-soaked bandage at his side. "You protect us," she said haltingly. "You good person." Baxter almost smiled at the simplicity of childhood logic. "Good and bad. black and white, with no room for the murky grays that adults swam through. He was not good. He had done terrible things during the wars, things that still haunted him in the small hours of the night when sleep refused to come. He remembered a raid on an alien outpost where he had killed not just soldiers, but anyone who stood in his way. He remembered the face of a young alien warrior, barely older than these children, begging for mercy in broken human speech, and he had given none. He had become the monster he now saw in his reflection, and no amount of protecting these two children could erase that blood from his hands. But to these children, who had seen him throw himself between them and certain death, who had watched him fight a bone crusher despite his wounds, who had felt his awkward attempts at comfort when Ivana had collapsed, he was their protector, their unexpected savior. The irony was not lost on him. He had spent years hating their entire species, blaming them for everything he had lost, and now two of their children looked at him with something approaching trust. It was enough to make him question everything he had believed about the aliens, about the war, about himself. He thought about simply running, leaving the children here in the cave, and disappearing into the wilderness before their people arrived. It would be easier that way, cleaner. No confrontation, no need to face the hatred in their parents' eyes. No need to try to explain the inexplicable. But even as the thought formed, he knew he could not do it. These children had learned to trust him, and abandoning them now would be a betrayal worse than leaving them at the waterfall. Whatever happened when their people arrived, he would face it standing between Ivana and Adadi, and whatever threat came for them, even if that threat was their own father consumed by understandable rage. Listen carefully, he said, making sure both girls were focused on him with complete attention. When your people come, you must tell them the truth. Tell them I saved you. Tell them I kept you safe. Can you do this? Both girls nodded solemnly, and he felt some of the weight lift from his shoulders. If he died today, at least they would survive. At least some good would come from this disaster. But he had no intention of dying easily. They reached a rocky area where the ground rose sharply, forming a series of cliffs and narrow passages. Baxter's military training, rusty but still present, identified it immediately as a choke point. One narrow defile between two massive stone faces, barely wide enough for a man to pass through, and easily defensible. If the pursuers caught up here, he could hold them off long enough for the children to escape, to be found by their people without him in the picture. It was the best chance they had. He found a small cave, really just a deep cleft in the rock face, hidden behind an outcropping. He pushed Ivana and Adadi inside, their small bodies fitting easily into the space, and crouched down to look them in the eyes. You stay here. No matter what you hear, no matter what happens, you stay quiet and you stay hidden. When your people come, when it is safe, you call out, not before. Do you understand? Tears welled in Ivana's eyes and Adadi clutched at his torn shirt, but they both nodded. Baxter reached up, removed the small knife from his belt, and pressed it into Ivana's hand. If something comes that is not your people, if something tries to hurt you, you use this. You protect your sister. You survive. His voice was harsh, but his hand lingered on her small blue fingers for just a moment. You are stronger than you know. He stood, his vision swimming with fever, and walked away before his resolve could weaken. He positioned himself at the entrance to the defile, axe in hand, and waited. He did not have to wait long. They came through the forest like a storm, 7 warriors in light armor, carrying spears and short swords, their blue faces set in expressions of grim purpose. At their head was a man who could only be the girl's father. The resemblance was clear in the bone structure, the shape of the eyes and the anguish that twisted his features into a mask of rage and pain. When his eyes fell on Baxter, standing blood-soaked and defiant in the narrow passage, something broke inside him. Torrin saw a monster, a human covered in dried blood, both his own and that of his victims, standing guard over a passage like a demon from nightmare. The axe in his hands was crusted with gore, his face a map of violence, his eyes cold and merciless. This was the creature that had taken his daughters, that had left that trail of blood and terror for him to follow. This was the thing that would pay for every second of fear his children had endured. He did not speak, did not demand the return of his daughters, did not ask for explanations. He simply attacked, his spear coming up as he charged forward with a roar of pure anguish. The warriors behind him followed, their weapons ready, but Torn was fastest, fueled by a father's desperate fury. Baxter saw the spear coming and brought his axe up to block. The impact sent shockwaves through his arms, nearly tearing the weapon from his weakened grip. He held on through sheer will, planted his feet, and pushed back. But his strength was failing, the fever sapping his muscles of their power, and he stumbled. A second spear thrust came from the side, and he twisted, feeling the blade scrape along his ribs, adding another wound to his collection. Pain was becoming background noise, something his body registered, but his mind could no longer fully process. He swung the axe in a wide arc, forcing the warriors back, and used the moment to set his footing. Torn came again, and this time Baxter could not fully block the strike. The spear shaft caught him across the temple, and the world exploded in white light. He went down hard, the axe clattering from his grip, and felt boots kicking at him, hands grabbing him, pulling him down further. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard shouting in the alien language, words he could not understand but whose meaning was clear. They were going to kill him, and slowly. Torn stood over the fallen human, his spear raised for the killing blow. All the rage, all the pain, all the fear of the past 3 days concentrated into that single point of sharpened steel. He would drive it through this monster's heart, and then they would search this area for what remained of his daughters. He would give them a proper burial, would honor their memory, would make sure everyone knew how they had been taken from him by human cruelty. The spear began its descent, and Torn put all his strength behind it. This was for Ivana. This was for Adadi. This was for justice and vengeance in a father's broken heart. And then the world stopped making sense. From somewhere behind the fallen human, from the very rocks themselves, came 2 small voices raised in desperate screams. Ivana and Adadi burst from their hiding place, their small legs pumping. As they ran toward the scene of violence, and they did not run to their father. They ran to Baxter. They threw themselves across his prone form, their small arms spreading wide as if they could shield his body with theirs. And they screamed at their father to stop, screamed in their native language, words tumbling over each other in desperate haste, begging and pleading and crying all at once. The spear stopped inches from Baxter's chest. Torn's arms locked in place as his mind struggled to process what he was seeing. His daughters alive, whole, crying not for rescue but for protection. Protection of the human he had been about to kill. Protection of the monster he had tracked for days. The warriors around him lowered their weapons in shock, and Karana pushed through their ranks, falling to her knees beside her children, her hands running over them frantically, checking for injuries, for harm, for anything that might explain this madness. Ivana was sobbing, her words coming between gasps, and she pointed at Baxter's still form. He saved us. He protected us. The bone crusher was going to eat us, and he fought it. He is hurt because of us. Please, Papa, please do not hurt him. Adadi, always quieter than her sister, clutched at her mother's arm and whispered through her tears. He gave us his cloak when we were cold. He gave us food when we were hungry. He kept us safe, Mama. He kept us safe. Torn's spear fell from nerveless fingers, clattering against stone. He stared at his daughters, at the torn pieces of his own leather jacket that had been carefully wrapped around their shoulders as makeshift protection from the elements. He saw how thin Baxter was, how his shirt was torn to strips for bandages and bindings, how every piece of equipment he might have used for his own comfort had been repurposed for the children. And he saw the wound, the terrible festering gashes in the man's side, exactly matching the claw pattern of a bone crusher. A wound taken while defending someone else. Shame hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. He had almost murdered their savior, had almost killed the one human who had shown his children mercy when he had every reason not to. He looked at his warriors, saw his own horror reflected in their faces, and felt the weight of what they had nearly done. Karana was weeping as she held her daughters, examining them thoroughly and finding nothing worse than scrapes and bruises, the normal injuries of children who had been traveling rough. She looked at Baxter, saw him struggling to remain conscious despite the beating he had just taken, and her medical training overrode everything else. She opened her pack, pulled out a jar of healing salve made from rare herbs native to their world, and moved toward him. Torin knelt beside the human, his hands shaking as he sheathed his weapons. He wanted to speak, to apologize, to explain, but words seemed inadequate. Instead, he helped his wife carefully roll Baxter onto his back, cutting away the ruined bandages to expose the infected wounds. What they saw made them both inhale sharply. The gashes were deep, running from ribs to hip, and infection had turned the edges green and purple. That this man had walked for 2 days with such injuries, had kept moving and kept the children safe, spoke of a will that defied comprehension. Kirana applied the salve with gentle hands, wincing at the heat radiating from his skin, and wrapped fresh bandages around his torso. Torin held a water skin to Baxter's cracked lips, supporting his head, feeling the man's labored breathing against his hand. This close, he could see the scars that covered Baxter's face and arms, the map of a warrior's life, and he recognized a kindred spirit. This was a man who had survived hell and kept going. Baxter's eyes fluttered open, unfocused, and glazed with fever. He saw blue faces hovering over him and tried to pull away, his hand reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. Torin caught his arm, not roughly but firmly, and spoke in heavily accented but clear human language. "Be still. We are not your enemies. Not anymore." Understanding filtered through the fever haze, and Baxter's struggles ceased. He looked past Torin to where Ivana and Adati huddled against their mother, both girls watching him with tear-stained faces. Ivana raised one small hand and waved, a gesture so simple and innocent that it cut through all the complexity of their situation. Baxter, despite everything, despite the pain and fever and exhaustion, raised his hand and waved back. Torin offered to have his warriors carry Baxter back to their settlement, offered healing and shelter and whatever recompense he felt appropriate for saving his daughters. But Baxter shook his head, his pride and independence asserting themselves even in his weakened state. He accepted help standing, leaning heavily on his axe, and gestured for them to keep the salve and bandages. He would manage. He always managed. "The children are safe," he said, his voice rough as gravel. That was the only thing that mattered. He took a step toward the forest, his gait unsteady, and felt a small hand slip into his. Evana had broken away from her mother and now stood beside him, her face set with determination. She said something in her language, rapid and insistent, and when Baxter looked confused, she switched to broken human speech. "You are hurt. You need help. Come with us." Baxter looked down at her, this small, blue-skinned child who had every reason to fear humans, who should have been grateful to see him leave, and she was begging him to stay. Behind her, Adati nodded vigorously, echoing her sister's request, and even Kirana and Torin were looking at him with something approaching hope. But Baxter knew he did not belong in their world. He was a relic of the wars, a ghost who had somehow found himself playing hero for one brief moment. He had done what needed doing, and now it was time to fade back into the shadows where he belonged. He knelt down, bringing himself eye level with Ivana, and gently removed her hand from his. With his thumb, he wiped a tear from her blue cheek, a gesture that felt foreign and strange, but somehow right. "You are safe now," he said quietly. "That is enough." He stood, swaying only slightly, and met Torin's eyes. The two warriors looked at each other across the divide of species and history, and something passed between them. Respect, recognition, understanding. Torin placed his fist over his heart in the salute of his people, and Baxter returned the gesture, his fist thumping against his chest despite the pain it caused. Then he turned and walked toward the tree line, each step deliberate and measured, his axe serving as a walking stick. Evana started to follow, but her mother held her back. The family stood together, watching the scarred human disappear into the forest, and Torin felt gratitude swell in his chest so powerfully it threatened to overwhelm him. He had come seeking a monster and found a hero. He had come for vengeance and received a lesson in mercy. He would tell this story to his people, would make sure everyone knew of the human warrior who saved his children when he had every reason to let them die. The name Baxter would become legend among his clan, a reminder that honor and courage were not bound by the color of one's skin. In the forest, Baxter allowed himself to lean against a tree once he was out of sight, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The salve was already working, dulling the pain and fighting the infection, but he was far from recovered. It would be weeks before he could move without agony, months before the wounds fully healed, and the scars would remain forever. One more set of marks to add to his collection, one more reminder of survival. But as he resumed his journey, heading toward the mountain caves where he made his home, he found that the weight he had carried for so long felt fractionally lighter. He had done something right, had saved two innocents who deserved protection regardless of their species, had proven, if only to himself, that he was still human beneath all the scar tissue and bitterness. It did not erase the things he had done, the blood on his hands from the wars. But it was something, a small light in a lifetime of darkness. The journey back to his cave took 3 full days in his weakened condition, days filled with fever dreams and moments of delirium, where he was not entirely sure if he was awake or asleep. He saw Ivana and Adadi in his dreams, but they were older, grown into warriors themselves, and they spoke to him in perfect human speech about honor and mercy. He saw Marcus and Elena too, but instead of accusing him as they usually did in his nightmares, they simply nodded and faded into mist, as if releasing him from some invisible debt. When he finally reached his cave and collapsed onto his sleeping mat, he was burning with fever, despite the cooling effects of the alien medicine. For 2 weeks he drifted in and out of consciousness, his body fighting the infection that had spread through his system. In his lucid moments, he forced himself to eat the dried meat and stored provisions he kept for emergencies, to drink water from the spring that ran through the back of his cave, to change his bandages with the last of the healing bark the children had collected for him. In his delirious moments, he relived the fight with the bone crusher over and over. But in these fevered visions, he was not fast enough, and the beast tore through Ivana and Adadi while he watched helplessly. He would wake screaming, drenched in sweat, and have to remind himself that they were safe, that he had succeeded, that they were with their family. When the fever finally broke, and his mind cleared completely for the first time in weeks, Baxter found himself staring at the rough stone ceiling of his cave and thinking about what had happened. He had saved 2 alien children who should have been his enemies. He had kept them alive through 2 days of hell, had taught them to survive, had fought their father's warriors while protecting them even in his last moments of consciousness. Why? The question had haunted him throughout his fever, and now, in the clarity that comes after surviving near death, he thought he finally understood. It was not about redemption, not really. He could not undo the things he had done during the war, could not bring back the dead or erase the pain he had caused. But he could choose in that moment to be something other than the monster the war had made him. He could choose to see 2 children instead of 2 enemies. He could choose mercy over vengeance. And that choice, small as it seemed in the vast scope of the universe, had mattered immensely. It took another 2 weeks before he could stand without his vision swimming, before he could walk the perimeter of his cave without needing to rest. The wounds had closed, leaving raised scars that pulled uncomfortably when he moved, but they would heal in time. Everything healed given enough time, even things that seemed permanently broken. He ventured outside his cave on a warm afternoon, feeling sunlight on his face for the first time in a month, and was surprised to find a small bundle wrapped in blue fabric sitting on a flat rock near his entrance. His hand went to his knife instinctively, scanning the surrounding forest for threats, but there was no one visible. Whoever had left this had come and gone without waking him. He approached cautiously and unwrapped the bundle. Inside was food, dried meat, and fruits preserved with honey, enough to last weeks. There was also a small carved figure, roughly the size of his palm, depicting a human warrior with an axe standing protectively in front of 2 small figures. The craftsmanship was exquisite, the details so fine he could see the scars on the warrior's face. And wrapped around the base was a strip of blue fabric torn from a child's tunic, with 2 names carefully embroidered in thread that shone silver in the sunlight. Ivana and Adadi. They had not forgotten him. Their family had not forgotten what he had done. Baxter sat heavily on the rock, holding the carving in his scarred hands, and felt something he had not experienced in years. Not quite happiness, not yet, but something close to peace. He had spent so long believing he was nothing but a weapon, a tool for killing that had outlived its purpose. But these children had seen something different. They had seen someone worth saving, worth remembering, worth carving into wood and carrying forward into whatever future they would build. Over the following months, as his strength gradually returned and he resumed his solitary existence, Baxter found himself changed in subtle ways he could not quite articulate. He still hunted, still survived, still moved through the wilderness with the same deadly efficiency that had kept him alive for years. But when he came across other travelers lost in the forest, he no longer simply avoided them. He left markers pointing toward water sources, placed bundles of edible plants near their campsites when they slept. Once even killed a predator that was stalking a pair of young human traders without them ever knowing he had been there. He did not seek recognition or thanks. He did not need them to know it was him. He simply acted, choosing mercy when he could, choosing to protect rather than ignore. It was a small thing, barely noticeable in the grand scheme of the world, but it mattered to him. Each act of quiet kindness was a reminder that he was more than the sum of his violent past. One evening, nearly 6 months after the encounter with Ivana and Adadi, Baxter was checking his snares when he heard voices speaking in the alien language. He froze, listening, and recognized immediately the cadence of children at play. He moved silently through the undergrowth until he could see them. A small group of alien children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, gathered in a clearing with an adult supervising from a distance. They were practicing with small wooden swords, learning the basics of combat in what appeared to be a training session. But what caught his attention was what they were saying. He understood enough of the language now, picked up during the wars, to follow their conversation. One of the children was telling a story, acting it out with dramatic gestures, while the others watched with rapt attention. It was his story, the story of the scarred human warrior who had saved the twin daughters of Torin despite being wounded himself, who had fought a bone crusher with nothing but an axe and determination, who had refused reward and disappeared back into the forest. But in the telling, it had become legend, embellished with details that made him seem larger than life. The child acting out Baxter's role swung his wooden sword in wide arcs, describing how the human had roared like thunder and moved like lightning, how he had stood between the children and death without fear or hesitation. The other children cheered at the climax of the story, when the warrior defeated the pursuing father in combat but spared his life, revealing the children were safe. It was not exactly how it had happened, but the core truth remained. The adult supervisor, an older warrior with graying hair, corrected some of the more fanciful additions, but nodded approvingly at the children's enthusiasm. Baxter watched from concealment as the elder warrior spoke about honor transcending the boundaries between species, about how true courage meant protecting those weaker than yourself regardless of who they were. He spoke about how the children of both species needed to learn from examples like Baxter, needed to understand that the wars had been driven by fear and misunderstanding, and that a new generation had the power to choose a different path. Baxter withdrew silently, leaving them to their training and their stories. He returned to his cave and sat outside as darkness fell, looking at the carved figure that he kept on a small shelf just inside the entrance. His story, or at least a version of it, was being told to children as an example of how to behave. The idea seemed absurd when he thought about all the blood on his hands, all the lives he had taken without mercy during the wars. But perhaps that was the point. Perhaps redemption was not about erasing the past, but about choosing differently in the present. Perhaps one act of mercy could ripple outward in ways impossible to predict, touching lives he would never meet, shaping futures he would never see.